Good morning and welcome to the HopeFilled Financial Podcast. My name is Jay Disberger, your one and only HopeFilled Financial Coach, and I'm happy that you're here with us today. Budgeting is going to be the sole focus of this episode. If you want to hear more on budgeting, don't forget to subscribe to the HopeFilled Financial Podcast. We release a new episode every Tuesday morning, and it would be an honor if you came along this budgeting journey with me. To get things started, I'm going to tell you a story from when Amanda and I were planning our wedding. A wedding budget serves not only as a means to make sure that you keep your expenditures for a wedding in check, but also if the couple, the engaged couple, is managing the budget for their wedding, it can serve as a miniature practice budget or season of budgeting for them that can indeed provide a great deal of preparation for them as they're getting ready to start their married life. My in-laws had an excellent plan when it came to funding the wedding for Amanda and I. They knew that there can be drama when it comes to decisions on what to buy and what not to buy for a wedding. Wedding planning itself can get pretty involved and fairly emotional, especially since there's so much money involved. And traditionally in America, the bride's family will pay for the bulk of the wedding. Now, that's traditional, that's not a rule, but that was the way that my in-laws approached it. And to make the process as easy as possible while also providing us with a means to practice communicating about money, they simply gave us the money that they wanted to use for the wedding. If we didn't use all of the money for the wedding, they said we could keep whatever was left over to help give our married life a kickstart. And that was very generous of them. They had basically sat down and asked themselves, what does a decent wedding cost? And how much are we able and willing to provide for that wedding? With the funds in hand, Amanda and I engaged with our first budgeting adventure with our wedding. And having the maximum amount that we could spend on the wedding that we were basically given by Amanda's mom and dad, we knew what we needed to keep the wedding under as far as cost goes. We weren't going to be providing anything over and beyond that. At least that was our plan. Naturally, the first question is, well, where do we begin? We have the money for the wedding, but we don't know exactly what it is that we're spending on. So we needed to break down what mattered to us and share with the things that we definitely wanted in the wedding, things that we would like in the wedding, and things that we don't necessarily need to spend the money for. Having the wedding budget was a great way for us to share our values and virtues with each other, practice communicating about money. It was also a great exercise for us for listening to each other and hearing what mattered to each other, how we were similar and how we were different. Here are a few examples of some of the things that we really wanted. We knew that we wanted to invite as many friends and family members as possible. Our number one factor on selecting a venue was going to be capacity for seating. Something that mattered to me, also connected to the venue, was the acoustics of the space. I've been to wedding receptions where the floor, the ceiling, the walls are very hard and it's kind of echoey. So when the father of the bride or the groomsmen are giving speeches, you ended up not being able to understand what it was they were saying. The intelligibility was low. And the music, when they were playing it loud, but it felt even louder in the space. I didn't want that. I wanted a wedding reception venue that had good acoustics built into it. I wanted good acoustical treatment. I wanted preferably a carpeted-ish floor, like a nice hotel ballroom. And I wanted a speaker system that was distributed throughout the room so that even though you had a lot of people in there, everyone could hear the speech and hear it intelligibly. For Amanda, she really valued the idea of having a video that we could watch and relive our wedding day in a short little 2-3 minute trailer style video that summarized the highlights. It was something that we had talked about when we were discussing photography. Originally, we decided that we weren't going to do the video so that the cost could go somewhere else. But Amanda came back and mentioned that it was something that she did think would be really valuable and that we should prioritize for that day. Things that we cut included the garter toss and the bouquet toss. This was because we didn't really value the idea of me crawling under her dress and doing the whole thing to get the garter and then tossing it. And that, alongside the bouquet toss, have roots and they're becoming a wedding tradition that we also didn't feel like we wanted to necessarily perpetuate. We also forewent getting a wedding planner. Amanda and I both enjoy planning things with details and getting the schedules worked out, and we had the time and the talent to do a good job with that. So we were able to save the money that we otherwise would have used to hire a wedding planner and applied it to some of our priorities like the wedding video. Another wedding tradition that we cut that's kind of interesting is the grand exit from the church. We had been to a number of weddings where it was fun to do the grand exit, and you got to throw rice or leaves or bubbles or have sparklers, and you cheer, and the couple runs out and they get into the fancy old car or the limousine. But the thing is the couple didn't go off typically to the venue, and they didn't go to take more pictures on their own. Most of the time, the grand exit ended up taking a little trip around the block with the fancy car that you rent, and the couple gets back out and goes into the church to take the family photos. The way our schedule was panning out for the wedding day, that was what we would have ended up doing. We would have done the grand exit from the church, more or less for show, had all the guests outside in the summer heat waiting for us to walk out. Then we would get into the fancy car that we rented just to drive around the block. Because this particular event was lacking utility and didn't have anything of substance that we valued, we weren't really wanting to put money towards a short car ride in a fancy car, and we didn't think it was going to be conducive for our wedding guests. We decided to simply cut that one out. And from what I could tell, I don't think anyone missed it. We were able to take the time that we saved from that and increase how much time we got to spend at the wedding reception. We also got to be extra intentional with our photographer selection. We had found that a number of wedding photographers charged for a package where they take the photos, but if you wanted digital files or if you wanted prints, they would be an additional charge down the road. I especially wanted to have access to the digital files without any additional fee. I wanted that to be wrapped up in the initial charge. Reason being is I have a printer where we could print basically any photo that we wanted. I didn't have any interest in buying prints. I didn't care if they charged for prints, but the digital photos, well, I certainly would want to have access to all of those, even if they were just raw photos that could be edited later. We ended up selecting a photographer with the most frugal package given our situation and what it was that we wanted from wedding photos. I also got to design the stationery, the invites, the save the dates, because I have some background in graphic design. I got to do some really cool color coordination stuff across the breadth of all of the things that needed printed for the wedding. And that saved us some money. We also saved some good money on wedding decorations. We didn't have any strong preferences for particular decorations other than the color. And decorating the tables was something that was going to be pretty expensive if you got very elaborate. We ended up going with more meaningful decorations that we could access for free, either from the venue or make homemade, and then added the wedding colors using the most inexpensive means that we could find, some synthetic rose petals that matched the colors that you could buy in bulk bags for just, basically a few dollars a bag. We sprinkled those on all the tables, and it looked elegant. And it looked elegant on a very tight budget for the decorations. This is a great example of us really directing the money toward what mattered most to us. And that's how the whole of the wedding ended up going as we worked through the wedding budget. Every decision reflected our values and priorities. The wedding day as a whole ended up being the perfect reflection of our relationship and the quality of our communication in preparing the wedding. Looking back, we wouldn't change a single thing about that day. We ended up with a wedding that had twice the number of guests as the average wedding for that year, but for half the cost of the average wedding in America for that year. And that is something that, in my opinion, reflects a really well thought out, frugal wedding budget. And while we're talking about weddings, let's shift our attention to the budget tip for the day. Today's budget tip is indeed about weddings. If you are planning a wedding in the near future, or have friends who are getting ready to engage with a wedding budget, This tip is for you. When Amanda and I did our wedding budget, we had a joint account of sorts for which we could spend on the wedding. If you have a joint account that you use for your wedding expenses and for your wedding budget, it's all tied together. It helps you communicate even more in a way that helps you basically train for your married life. When it comes to joint accounts versus separate accounts in marriage, I am a strong proponent of joint accounts, and I think the wedding budget is a great time to practice that. I'm a proponent of joint accounts because the number one indicator of a failing marriage is simply thinking that your spouse spends money foolishly. If you have separate accounts and you allow your money to kind of go and do its own things based on your own respective priorities, it's more likely, especially over time, that your spouse's spending starts to deviate from the way that you think would be wise. And if spending starts to deviate and you end up further off the same page from each other, well, that increases the likelihood that you hold some sort of silent thought against the way that your spouse spends money. If you have a joint account and you both go and spend a great deal of money at the same time without really communicating about it, you run the risk of overdrawing your checking account. And that's not necessarily healthy. So when you have the joint account, you have to communicate about what you're going to spend and when. You need a budget. And that budget is going to help you practice communicating about money. It's going to give you an opportunity, just like the wedding budget did for Amanda and I, where we could speak our values and what matters to us into the mutual spending from that account. Because spending, giving, and saving decisions then have to be made together in the budget, there's not much room to think that your spouse spends poorly because you vet out and agree on things as you go along. The Bible says it best. Whether you're a believer or not, I think that this wisdom is incredibly powerful. Where your treasure is, there your heart will lie also. If you can agree on where your treasure is going, if you can agree on where your money's going, then your hearts will grow together in that direction. Separate accounts put you at a higher risk for letting your treasure go into separate directions and letting your hearts grow apart. Let's now shift our attention away from the weddings into a question submitted by you. Today's question comes from Casey. Casey commented on episode 11 on the YouTube channel for the HopeFilled Financial Podcast. Casey says, "Thanks, Jay. You mentioned savings rate as the best predictor of financial success. How do you calculate savings rate? And what should be the savings rate goal?" Thank you, Casey, for your question. And also thank you so much for commenting on the YouTube videos that we've been producing with the podcast. I sincerely appreciate it. Let's back up and talk about where the importance for savings rate comes from. Ramsey Solutions did a study where they basically were looking at the factors that correlate to individuals who had enough money to retire with dignity. In particular, they were looking at people who were considering themselves financially successful, those who had peace with their personal finances, and those who had basically secured their financial futures. It turns out that the number one factor that correlates to someone who's successful at securing their financial future is their savings rate, which makes sense. If you save money, you'll have money saved. Back to your question, how do you calculate savings rate? Savings rate is going to simply be a division problem. You're going to have your saving and investing summed up at the numerator, and then in the denominator, you're going to put your income. You could do a savings rate for the month. So in your budget, you could say, this is the money I'm saving this month. This is the money I'm investing. Don't forget to include any money in there that's being withheld from your company for like a 401k or an employee retirement program where they're matching stuff. You include your contribution, not the company match. And when you write your income in the denominator, you include that money that they're also putting aside there. Effectively, you want your take-home pay plus your withholdings for retirement, not necessarily taxes. In short, take your savings and your investing, add them together, divide that sum by your income. That gives you your savings rate. While you can do this month to month, your savings rate's going to go up and down. A better picture of your overall savings rate is going to be your annual savings rate. If you were to look at your total income for the year and your total savings and investing for the year and calculate your savings rate that way. This prevents your savings rate from looking inflated for the things that you save for throughout the year if you have like car insurance that you pay once every 6 months or 12 months. The next part of your question is the harder one to answer. What is a good savings rate? If you ask Dave Ramsey, he's going to point to baby step 4, where he suggests that you save 15% for retirement. Naturally, that's going to be his baseline, his minimum savings rate for you because, well, you're probably saving money beyond just retirement. So he's going to see a savings rate of closer to 15 to 20% is healthy. The Money Guys are another group that gives financial insights. They're based in Tennessee, not too far from Ramsey. They've recently done a joint podcast episode, which I found to be pretty interesting. The Money Guys suggest something closer to 30% for your savings rate. If you look at the FIRE community, Financial Independence, Retire Early, the material that you can find from that community on the internet is going to tell you that you need at least 50% of a savings rate to be considered healthy. And they've got examples of people who are saving like 75+% of their income. That kind of life is not for everyone. A healthy savings rate for you is going to be one that is covering all of your savings goals. You see that all of your goals are on track and you're going to be meeting your goals on time according to your priorities. It's also going to be the rate which encompasses enough investing for retirement so that you can retire with dignity. It's also going to be the rate that's not so high that you're sacrificing your day-to-day life today and basically taking away from your joy because you're spending so very little now. Remember, in the first 4 episodes of the HopeFilled Financial Podcast, we discussed frugality. Frugality is going to be the most effective and efficient means for you to optimize the amount of happiness that you get per dollar that you spend, save, or give. It's going to optimize the utility you get. If you end up being suboptimal to frugality in your daily spending today, your savings rate may be too high. How do you know your savings goals and your retirement goals are on track? Well, that's what we're going to start talking about in the main topic as we go over the zero-based budget. Today, we're going to focus primarily on the nuts and bolts behind what a zero-based budget is. We're going to do a deep dive into the things that I get questions with when I've helped teach what a zero-based budget is and how it works. I'm also going to share some of the lessons that I have applied to my own personal budget as we go through this. If you've listened to the podcast before, you've heard me briefly summarize that a zero-based budget is when you take your income, you put it up top. Below that, you add your saving, spending, and giving. This is the money that's going out from your checking account. You take your income minus that sum and it equals 0. Effectively, mathematically, you're assigning every dollar of your income a mission, be it saving, spending, or giving. And that's it. That's a zero-based budget. You can have a budget that is simply that simple with just 3 categories, saving, spending, and giving. But if you're not more specific than that, it might be challenging to actually hit your goals. So the right budget for you is going to be one that's not overly complicated, but it's specific enough that you can be tracking your progress on your budget throughout the month and know that you're not overextending yourself on something. My personal budget has about 90 individual line items on it, and I consider my budget to be slightly more complicated than the average budget, and that's just because I'm like a bit of a nerd on it. So the right number of categories for you could be as low as 15 or 30. It could also be as high as 200. A budget is a reflection of your priorities. A budget is basically you taking the reins, taking control, telling your money what to do instead of the lack of money telling you what you cannot do. A budget embodies genuine freedom. By exercising discipline and giving yourself boundaries with money, by making decisions on paper on purpose, by having a plan, you're effectively freeing yourself up to pursue your priorities that you put on that plan. So what happens if you end up like me and you have so many line items in your budget as you're breaking down what matters to you and it's starting to look very complicated? In that case, you can take all of those line items and sort them into larger, more global categories. And by breaking them into more bite-sized pieces like that, you make your budget more easy to organize and more easy to digest. Next, I'm going to basically share with you what categories I use in my zero-based budget. The The first main category that I use is giving. I typically put giving as the top item, the top category in my budget. And that's because I believe that it's important for me, that it's my calling to not give what I have left over after spending. If I give myself that method, I'm probably just going to expand my own spending and outspend what I could otherwise then give. If I make giving a priority ahead of time, I can adjust my spending and modify it so that my giving can match the priorities for what matters to me, or what I feel religiously called to do with my giving. Now, don't get me wrong. I don't recommend that you give money away when you are struggling to cover your four walls. The four walls being transportation, housing, utilities, and food. But if you have discretionary income that can be spent on once, saved, or given away, it can be very valuable to take what you want to do with giving and put that as your top priority. After giving, I list all of my essentials. The next main category are my essentials. This is where the four walls live, and this is also where insurance lives for me. If you're working to get out of your non-mortgage debt, debt will be your next main category. On episode 12, I covered the debt snowball in more depth. That's basically where you would store your debt snowball. You would list all of your debts, smallest balance to largest balance, and work through your debt snowball here after you've covered your essentials. If you're working on getting out of debt and you're looking for some more information or motivation, I highly recommend that you listen to episodes 9, 10, and 12. Episode 13 can be pretty insightful as well. The next category that I have in my personal budget is lifestyle. Lifestyle is where I include the day-to-day expenses that aren't essentials, but are a part of my life. This is where I have traveling to see family, eating out, entertainment, and recreation. After lifestyle, I have the emergency fund. Now, the emergency fund is a single line item all to itself in my budget, but it's so important and I want to emphasize that importance, so I make it a category as well. It also helps me keep my accounts sort of organized. Every time I have a separate savings account or investment account, I make it its own category in my budget. And I break down the contents of those accounts into different goals, different sinking funds, if you will. And the sum of those should equal what is in that account. Makes it pretty easy to reconcile those savings accounts or investment accounts come the end of each month. After the emergency fund, I have my general savings account, or savings for short. This category includes anything I'm saving for that I expect to buy in the next 5 years or so, or any money that I need to have liquid possibly in the next 5 years. For example, a healthcare deductible would probably live here. And it's here where you can start investigating if your savings rate is enough for you. When you have your different budgeting categories, you're typically going to have a column or a section where you write down what it is that you expect to spend, save, or give for each individual line item. Next to that, you're going to have another column or another section where you can record, or it's automatically recorded, what it is that you've spent already. After that, I put my budget in a spreadsheet, really like a column that shows me the difference between those two so I know how much is left in my budget and I can check it throughout the month and see what my progress is, or if I've overspent on a category. But when it comes to the savings account, you can add a couple more sections or columns. You can add what it is that you have saved for each individual sinking fund. You can also add what it is that you want to have saved. So your goal, your savings goal. This is basically the framework you need to make your goals a reality. If you feel so inclined, it can be very helpful to put a date on which you want to have that sinking fund or that savings goal completely saved up for. And in that way, you can then calculate how much you should be saving each month, how much you should be setting aside for that particular sinking fund every time your paycheck comes through in order to stay on track to meet your goal by your due date. After the savings accounts, I break up the next categories per my investment accounts. This is going to include retirement. I have a category for all my retirement stuff. I also have a category for my son. We have a ESA that we're using to save for his future educational expenses. And any savings that we have beyond that, we have invested in an account that is a taxable brokerage account, the purpose of which is for any savings goal that is more than 5 to 10 years out. And we save here so that that money has a little bit more time to grow. And by the time we save up for that goal that is that far away, compound interest can help us reach those goals without us having to save absolutely every dollar of those goals. This can be especially helpful for very large items like a car or a home down payment. Now, that isn't to say that you have to invest when you have big goals or goals that are far out into the future. It's just something that I personally do that I think is prudent for us. When it comes to investments, you need to make sure that you never invest in anything that you don't understand. And if you're needing help with making investments, seeking advice from a licensed professional can be very helpful. As long as you're seeking knowledge and building an understanding of what it is that you're doing with investments before you engage with it, you're probably going to be all right. The last category that I have in my personal budget is discretionary. You could also maybe call this one the luxury category. This is where you put the big items that are luxuries, like vacations, or if you wanted to buy a boat or an RV and it wasn't an essential need, it's a big toy, it's a big event, it's a luxury. Let's use a vacation as an example. You've saved up for a really big vacation. It's your dream vacation. And that money lives under the sinking fund for vacation in your savings account. On the month, when you plan on pulling that money out to pay for your vacation, you would list a negative line item in that savings account on that line item in the budget. This indicates that you're pulling that money out from that sinking fund in order to spend it in another category. And that category would live under discretionary or under luxury. It would say vacation, and you would have an equal-ish amount there to the money that you're pulling out from savings. That negative number in the savings helps keep the budget balanced. And that's basically in a nutshell how the budget works, how the zero-based budget works. There are two more things that I want to cover before we end today's episode. The first is, it's not an uncommon question for when you're working a zero-based budget, and you say, okay, everything going into my checking account is going out. Does that mean that my checking account begins and ends with a zero balance? And the answer there is no, but it does begin and end every month with the same value. This value, the amount that you keep in your checking account, is lovingly referred to in my world as the buffer. The buffer is probably going to be equal somewhere between half to 100% of your monthly income. The buffer serves as a way that you don't overdraft if you're waiting for a paycheck to come through later in the month, but you have the rent or the mortgage coming due before all of that money has come back in. The buffer in the checking account, if it's equal to your monthly income, is going to give you permission to spend money, give money, or save money that's in your budget anytime throughout the month, even if your paycheck hasn't hit. This is a great way to break the paycheck to paycheck cycle because you're no longer dependent on when that paycheck comes through. Another way of thinking about it is you're budgeting the money at the start of the month that lives in the checking account, and you know that your income is simply going to refill it. You're basically a month ahead on your money. So the buffer isn't then, in that mindset, money that you have saved, but more or less money that you have ready to spend to live on that next month. The last thing that I want to share with you about the zero-based budget today is that your budget is going to be planned out, but if you don't know how it's going or how it ended, well, how do you know if it worked? You're going to need to update your budget throughout the month and track how you're doing. That way you know how much you have left to spend for given categories, especially food. Food is one that is always difficult to stay on track with. And at the end of the month, if you've overspent or underspent, then what do? Well, if you spent more than you budgeted, that money has to come from somewhere. Typically, it's going to peel away at your savings, and you're not going to be able to save as much that month or give as much that month as you had otherwise planned. If you end up having to take away from your savings goals month after month because you're not staying on track with your spending budget, well, that's evidence that your savings goals or your savings rate is suffering because you're spending it. And if you're spending away what you otherwise need to be saving in order to have a healthy savings rate, and you're spending it on once, well, that gives you evidence that you need to do something to change your spending behavior during the month in order to make your savings goals happen. And this budget is the plan that enables you to do that on purpose and also quantify by how much you need to make a change. And if you didn't spend as much as you had in your budget, you have some left over, Well, what do you do with that money? You get to decide. You get to decide what savings priority you have that you want to put that money toward, or if there was a splurge that you wanted to engage with that money, well, you get to choose what that's going to be, and you can do it intentionally. In the end, what you have actually made that month for income, minus your actual giving, your actual spending, and your actual saving, still needs to equal zero. So at the end of the month, you reconcile your budget. You reconcile what actually happened and still make it zero-based. That way you're still given every dollar a mission, not only proactively, but you verified that it happened. It keeps you on track and it keeps you honest with yourself on what it is that you're doing with your money. Running a zero-based budget without reviewing it, without reconciling it, is kind of like driving a car that doesn't have any rearview mirrors and doesn't have a GPS. You don't have anything to tell you where you've been, and you don't have anything to tell you if you've made a wrong turn. And yes, it is important to not only write a different budget for every month, but reconcile it every month. And yes, every month is different. There are holidays that only fall on the calendar once a year, and that month is going to be different because of that. If you're like me, you want to make this perfect cookie cutter budget that you can go copy paste every month. There are parts that you can copy paste in between months, but the budget as a whole is going to be different. There's no such thing as a normal month. Every month is its own different and unique animal that needs to be approached with time and care and planning in its own unique budget. If you're looking for motivation on starting a budget, on starting a zero-based budget, well, that's what we're going to be covering next week. We're going to be talking about the whys, the motivating drivers behind budgeting regularly and turning budgeting into a life-changing habit. Until then, budget bravely and enjoy your hope-filled financial future.